We don't know the exact figures, and we never will. As the Red Army advances in the east and the Allies progress in the west, the Nazis decide to evacuate the concentration camps. Nearly 700,000 prisoners are thrown out onto the roads. They cross fields, forests, and villages, along seas and rivers to reach a Germany in decline. Between 250,000 and 300,000 men and women die along the way from cold, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion when they're not being shot down by their guards or by civilians who see these columns of wretched people marching by. Images of these marches are rare, but some survivors who have testified for history on what had been the Nazi extermination project have recounted their senseless journeys. The death marches remain the least known episode in the history of Nazism. To tell the story is to shed new light on the apocalyptic collapse of the Third Reich that terrified Europe for 12 years. On July 24, 1944, the Red Army enters the huge concentration camp of Majdanek, located near Lublin in present-day Poland. Gas chambers, crematoria, gallows, mass graves, and piles of the victims' personal effects are there for all to see. The Nazi High Command didn't have time to erase all material traces of the genocide. That first liberation of a camp in the east uncovers one of the main cogs of the final solution. With the exception of a few hundred prisoners, the sick and those unfit to travel who were left behind, the 15,000 prisoners who occupied the camp have disappeared. Faced with the advance of the Red Army on the Eastern Front, the SS have emptied Majdanek.
Prisoners are transferred from Lublin-Majdanek in a more or less orderly fashion in several stages from the spring of 1944, because the Soviet front is getting closer. They're not at the evacuation stage yet. Evacuation is being prepared, but they're starting to transfer some prisoners in conditions that aren't yet extremely lethal. There will be hundreds of deaths, but the situation hasn't turned chaotic yet.
From April 1944, the SS organized the departure of tens of thousands of prisoners. Men and women took the roads separating Majdanek camp from the outskirts of the city of Lublin.
And then the front came closer to Majdanek. But that time we understood that they running, that they have to go away. You know, you have to be pretty dumb not to know what was. We didn't know that they were liberated, that already some parts of Poland are free, you know, we didn't know this. You know, Eastern Poland. And we had to march with them again. And that march was awful. It was so hot, without food and burned feet, and so hot and dirty and filthy. And the dogs right beside you, because there were a lot of guards and Germans, you know, they all were running.
A few miles past Lublin, the prisoners arrive at Shimelov train station before being crammed into cattle wagons. The bad treatment the guards are accustomed to inflicting on their prisoners continues on these journeys. Nevertheless, the vast majority of the captives arrive alive, principally at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, located 250 miles away. The Nazi High Command ordered those first transfers in order to be able to cope with the advance of the Soviet forces on the Third Reich territories. The shifting of prisoners to locations still under German control is considered temporary at the time, just until the military situation is reversed.
Pierre Vidal-Naquet used to say that in order to write history, you don't have to know the end. We know the end. And not only do we know the end, but with hindsight, we can clearly see that the war is lost for the Reich, let's say from Stalingrad on. That the Reich cannot win. But the perception that we have is not the perception that the people at that time have, and that's not the perception that the Nazis have. Until the end, that is up to May 1945, some Nazis, maybe not all of them, had the belief that they could turn the tide of the war and win it.
Indeed, despite Operation Bagration launched on June 22, 1944 by the Red Army, Hitler refused to contemplate the prospect of the Wehrmacht collapse on the Eastern Front. And yet, within 2 months, the Red Army frees the Russian territories in Belarus from German occupation. More than 350 miles are reconquered to the edge of the Vistula. It is colossal, especially since in the West, the situation isn't any better for the Wehrmacht. Since June 6, 1944, with the landing of the Allies in Normandy, then in Provence on August 14th, the Third Reich is caught in a vice.
It was because of this pincer movement and the idea that the Allies could enter the camps that the Nazis decided to evacuate them.
It's in this context that the order given by Heinrich Himmler on June 17, 1944, comes into force. The Reichsfuhrer of the SS distributes a text regulating the abandonment of the concentration camps according to the advance of the enemy troops, titled Concentration Camp Security for Case A. The document assigns full responsibility of evacuations to senior police and SS officials. These are the ones who will decide unilaterally on the departure of the prisoners in regard to the military situation in their geographical area. The vagueness of the order, like the multiplication of interlocutors involved, will have tragic consequences on the hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the concentration camp network developed by the Third Reich.
It's really in 44 that we're dealing with something sprawling, with more than 500 camps, with around 20 main camps and 500 other camps distributed throughout the German European area. These camps will be evacuated one to the other in a permanent movement and with excess mortality, which will weigh very heavily in the death toll of the victims of the concentration camps.
It's now the Ostland camps, located in the Baltic countries, which concern the SS, because they are next in line to be liberated by the Red Army in the wake of Operation Bagration. In these ghettos transformed into concentration camps in Riga, Kovno, Vilnius, the SS draw manpower, children included, to power the industrial machinery of the Third Reich.
The first evacuations, the first withdrawals, Rückzug as they're called, are organized with a purpose, let's say military-industrial. It's a question of providing security, preserving a workforce that must somehow contribute to the war effort, which is supposed to continue. As the Nazi discourse and the Nazi belief that there will be a reversal are quite widespread, they believe they are producing weapons, which will enable a geostrategic turnaround.
A few days before the Red Army crosses the Baltic states' borders, the transfer of captives is decided. Consequently, there's great hope for the liberation of the camps for hundreds of thousands of prisoners, raised by the combined military pressure of the Allies and the Soviets. But it's about to turn into yet another nightmarish episode.
All of us together, the men and women, pushed us into those cattle trains. It was that night, and the second day, we were traveling, and suddenly the trains were stopped. And they asked everybody to get out. And this is when all the men were taken away from us, and my father among them. And the last look on his face, saying, "We will meet again. And don't worry, I'll be okay. Just keep yourself alive and we'll meet again." He said that. And sad, trying with bright eyes, but a sad face. And that was the last time I saw him.
While some of the prisoners from the Baltic camps have been transported by trains, a few thousand among them are leaving by boat. They reach the territories of present-day Poland, still occupied by the Germans, to be imprisoned in Stutthof by the Baltic Sea.
We could hear in the distance from the boat. We could hear the shots from, the artillery fire. I don't know what. But there were Russian ships which must have been cruising not far from there or something. But anyway, it wasn't a bundle of laughs, let me tell you. So in this hold, at the bottom of the hold, you had everything. You had old people, sick people, you had everything. We experienced such horrible, overcrowded conditions.
July 20th, 1944. Hitler greets Mussolini on the platform of an East Prussian train station. This will be the last meeting between the two dictators. With the pierced eardrum, paralyzed arm, and burnt hair, the Führer is miraculously unscathed. While he was examining maps at his headquarters, a bomb exploded at his feet.
The summer of 1944 is a catastrophic summer for the Nazis. It raises awareness, even though it's rather belated, among Wehrmacht officers who understood that Hitler's rationality wasn't at all strategic anymore. And they concluded that this man had to be eliminated. It's not the first attack, but it's an attack that really comes from the heart of the system. The consequence of that is that the attack on July 20th, 1944 gives almost absolute power to Himmler, who's the most faithful of the faithful, and who's the most radical, the most fanatical, etc. And so in all the areas, including the military, it's now Himmler who is responsible for everything.
The concentration of all powers in the hands of an absolute leader of the SS aims to put an end to the divisions, even the disorganization of the machinery of the Nazis. The Third Reich is all set to tackle this war it still thinks it can win. In March 1944, a few months before the attack which cost him an eardrum rather than his life, Hitler launched Operation Margaret. Under this codename, the Wehrmacht units invade Hungary, a former ally of Germany, to prevent the Hungarians from negotiating an armistice with the USSR. During that spring of 1944, 50,000 Jews, survivors of the Auschwitz selections, crossed the Hungarian city of Győr, halfway between Budapest and Vienna. These male and female laborers will be in charge of building the fortifications intended to protect the Austrian capital. This is one of the only existing archives of the forced marches. Men and women lower their gaze or stare at the camera. Some with frightened faces, others overwhelmed, sometimes smiling because the hope of a better fate helps you to walk, especially when carrying your baby on your back. It is by the thousands that death will strike them down on the road, collapsing from exhaustion or coldly shot by the guards escorting them. The march of 50,000 Jews from Budapest to Vienna inaugurates the tragic era of the Great Death Marches. From January 12, 1945, the Red Army begins its Great Winter Offensive. The goal? First, liberate Poland completely. After crossing the Vistula, the troops take Warsaw, Lodz, Poznan, and advance straight to what is the current German border. In February 1945, the Russians reach the banks of the Oder, 45 miles away from Berlin, the German capital. Abandoned to their fate, the 4.5 million Germans living in East Germany and in the occupied territories take to the road. They're fleeing the Soviet soldiers. Unfortunately, in many cases, the Red Army troops prove worthy of the terror they inspire. Nearly 40% of Soviet fighters have lost a family member because of German atrocities, and war propaganda has kept urging them to revenge. It's against this backdrop of military debacle, enmity, and murderous rage that the evacuation of the largest concentration camp complex located on the territory of present-day Poland at Auschwitz-Birkenau takes place.
The Soviets were in Krakow until that point, and all of a sudden they're marching towards the Reich, and Auschwitz is the eastern tip of the Reich. You really have to keep this in mind. Auschwitz is the moment when the Soviets enter Germany.
In mid-January 1945, the camp manager, Heinrich Schmauser, receives the following instructions. In the camps placed under your responsibility, not one single prisoner in good health can be left behind. Upon receipt of this order, Schmauser hesitates. What to do? How does he dress, feed, and transport such a population in this part of Europe, which is now a gigantic gridlock mixing fugitives and fighters? What was the first thought of the Soviet soldiers around 3 p.m. on January 27, 1945, as they walked through the gates of Auschwitz? Crematoria and gas chambers have been dismantled or destroyed. Auschwitz is empty. Except for the piled-up corpses and these unfortunate people filmed by Russian cameramen. Abandoned in the camp by the SS because of their poor physical state, they will, in fact, be the first ones to be freed. The Germans had disappeared. The miradors were empty, writes Primo Levi in the story of his concentration camp ordeal, If This Is a Man.
Not all prisoners experienced the death marches. If you take the Auschwitz camps, There are approximately 7,000 prisoners who escaped the death marches, either because they were too sick to leave, or because they weighed up their chances and decided to hide. 7,000 out of 1 million murdered in Auschwitz, and with 60,000 to 70,000 who've been sent on the roads. It's tiny. But it's not negligible because among them there was Primo Levi, and also among them was Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. And if Otto Frank hadn't returned, there would be no Anne Frank's diary. And if Primo Levi hadn't returned, there wouldn't have been this piece of work so important from a historical and literary point of view.
10 days earlier, between January the 17th and the 21st of 1945, facing the Soviet steamroller, the SS evacuated approximately 56,000 prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau and the satellite camps. What is thought to be a transfer of prisoners will turn into the death marches.
The key word is chaos. From January 45 on, all these evacuations are chaotic in the extreme, in conditions, in addition it's January, appalling climatic conditions for the prisoners, who will be rushed into massive transfers, which are called death marches, and which are split between actual marches and train transfers, sometimes to camps and sometimes afterward, with further marches. So you could say that there are as many scenarios as there have been evacuations and evacuation columns. There's not one single death march, even for a single camp.
We barely had time to grab a woolen blanket to roll up and sling over our shoulders. We lined up. They gave us a loaf of bread and a can of meat. Outside, I heard behind me, they shut Auschwitz down. That was January 18th, 1945. We started marching, escorted by the SS. Others followed with dogs. We're walking, we're walking, we're walking. Then we started hearing screams and shotguns. Then shots rang at the front. That is when we saw corpses with crushed brains on the side of the road.
Although execution by shooting is legion, it's illness and exhaustion that cause the greatest number of deaths after these months or years of detention. No one gave water to the marchers who were forced to suck on bits of ice, a practice that relieves them for a time before increasing their feeling of thirst. As for the meager foods distributed at the start, supposed to last several days, they were devoured on the spot by the starving prisoners.
It's snowing, it's cold, we're hungry, we can't walk any longer. We're walking like robots, following each other's footsteps. We are weakening. And then the men don't want to walk anymore. They collapse in the snow. My father has visions. We are next to each other. We help each other. We take each other's hands, we take each other's elbows, and he's walking. But he's having visions created by hunger, created by I don't know what. I'm not a doctor, but he's having visions. In the night he sees this Jules Verne flying ship. And my father is at the end of his life, at the end of his strength. He's telling me to go. He's telling me to leave him. Well, it's out of the question, of course. And I had the miracle and the luck, and there's a Frenchman among all these men who hears me and comes to my aid. He takes hold of my father on one side, and I take him from the other side, and we make it to Gleiwitze.
This movement, this mobility, this liberation possibility, you know, brings in a kind of new motivation for the individuals because they want to keep going. But in a way, they're only as healthy as their last march, you know, and where they're going to next. And so it's very hard to think to the future, think ahead. And that's why friends are so important on these marches, to be that support network and to be that person. And there are studies done of the people who survived, the highest percentage survived with someone else, in terms of having someone to lean on, a companion, a friend, a relative. So it's that survival in pairs.
Nobody knows how many prisoners died in Poland on the icy roads, at the bottom of ditches, in the forests. Here in Gliwice Cemetery, several hundred Auschwitz prisoners of different nationalities, Jews and non-Jews, murdered by their guards on the way to their evacuation in January 1945, rest since 2007 in this common grave.
The objective of the Nazis, if they'd wanted to kill them all, they would have done it immediately. Here we are dealing with something else, which is in fact part of the Nazi ideology. It's that we have individuals who have been totally reified, who are relegated to the rank of commodities, and we transfer goods from one place to another, somehow, whatever the cost. And it doesn't matter if these goods break along the way. That's exactly what it is, and obviously they're facing extreme violence.
If the generic term used is death marches, thousands of prisoners traveled part of the way by train, suffering as atrociously as those who marched. On a congested, damaged, bombarded network, these convoys intended for the transfer of goods or livestock, and not for the transportation of human beings, will become gigantic morgues. Filmed clandestinely in the Czech Republic by an amateur filmmaker, these are the only existing images of the passage of the evacuees from Auschwitz. In the trains, these silhouettes, subjected to Nazi madness, have been through hell.
We were put into little mineral wagons. There was no cover. We were between 100, 110, and 150 per wagon. Impossible. We had to stay standing the whole time. From time to time, we tried together to get on our heels, but it wasn't easy. It was out of the question. We were dying of suffocation. There were so many of us. We shouldn't have been put there. And I saw one of my comrades who could no longer find... No one wanted to give up the few centimeters between himself and his neighbor. He was tossed around in this wagon till he died. It's something terrible for us. For me, this is one of the most painful moments of the camp. That death. For which we were all co-responsible, and without being so, it was a horrible moment.
At the start of winter 1945, the concentration camp population is in perpetual motion. By train or on foot, columns of prisoners crisscross this eastern part of Europe. A large group of 15,000 inmates has left Auschwitz to reach Grossrosen after a horrendous 12-day march.
Behind us, there was a constant bombardment from the front. So the SS, for fear of being caught, tried to change their trajectory. We were, I believe, a day or two away from reaching Grossrosen camp. We were gathered in the morning on the road very early, ready to leave. And at that very moment, some peasants from the village arrived with their carts and unloaded barrels of boiled potatoes. The prisoners in the front row, who were facing the barrels, we were so hungry that they rushed to eat the potatoes, and chaos ensued. And the SS, taken aback by this chaos, started firing. It was abominable. The snow was red with blood. The potatoes were red with blood. Some comrades had fallen with their heads split in the potatoes. We pushed away the bodies of our comrades who had been shot, and then we ate the potatoes anyway because we were so hungry. Then we arrived at Gross Rosen camp. And when we were counted at the entrance of the camp, more than 800 comrades had been shot or had died of exhaustion along the road. In 12 days, we had lost more than 800 comrades.
Gross Rosen, located 186 miles from Auschwitz on the western route, becomes the receptacle for thousands of prisoners arriving from the camps further east. With nearly 77,000 prisoners, it was during this period an overcrowded detention camp with Dantesque conditions. When the order to evacuate Gross Rosen's principal camp is given at the beginning of February 1945, only SS subordinates manage the logistical problems posed by the movement of approximately 40,000 prisoners. Their mission is to repatriate the prisoners in the camps located inside the Reich territory: Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, and others. On the territory located today in Poland, one last camp must be emptied before the arrival of the Soviets, the Stutthof, by the Baltic Sea. On the itinerary, supplies for the prisoners and guards to escort them. Everything is detailed by Paul Werner Hoppe, the camp commander. Even the behavior to adopt with regard to prisoners who lose their lives on the way is explained. It is recommended to concentrate the corpses in a single place and bury them all together. The Stutthof has more than 46,000 prisoners, many of them Jews. Around half of them take to the road on January 25, 1945. None of them are wearing suitable clothing. Some don't even have shoes.
We were lined up like usually to go to work. And since we didn't have any belongings, they just said, you have your blanket, you have your dish, your dish for food. Yes, we are leaving the camp. So, where are we going? Nobody told us. They just said we are evacuating the camp. And this is how it started, our death march. We call it the death march because we, the inmates, gave it the name.
I'll never forget when these three sisters were pulling their sisters, the two pulling their sisters, and the SS noticed. They just took her out from their arms to the side of the road and shot her right in front of them, in front of everybody. And we had to go on.
The more time passes, the more the situation worsens and deteriorates. And the more rage and despair there is, what in German is called Aussichtslosigkeit, that is, the total absence of perspective, spreads amongst the population. And so when there's no longer this projection into a possible future, then only the necessities of the moment count. Now the necessity of the moment is to try to escape the Soviets. To escape the Soviets, you have to go faster and faster. The people who walk the slowest represent a danger that they eliminate by shooting them down.
The fate of the women marchers, who left from a satellite camp of the Stutthof and arrived in Palmnicken, a small town located along the Baltic Sea, is in this respect emblematic. There are 3,000 female prisoners, mostly Jewish, crossing the town on January 27th. The weather is terrible. The guards have run out of food. The local people don't hide their hostility towards the prisoners, who are exhausted, hungry, and covered with vermin. As for the guns of the Red Army, they are deafening. So, after a few days of procrastination, the women are taken to the coast. Late at night, we arrived at the sea. We climbed a cliff overlooking the deep abyss of the Baltic Sea. On both sides of our line were men armed with machine guns who were firing into the crowd as the inmates advanced. When I reopened my eyes, I was in the middle of a raging sea, clinging to a small strip of frozen land, surrounded by a heap of corpses. Only 200 survivors managed to escape and will spread the news of this exceptional massacre.
So the death marches are one that uses the landscape as complicit in that extermination, one that also involves the guards, the villages where people are walking through, the witnessing. Around 30% of those people who are moved will die during the death marches, and that is through intentional killings and also through fatigue and exhaustion.
From February 1945, the Anglo-American and the Soviet fronts are closing in on the Reich. The air war waged by the Allies is at its peak. In Berlin, while part of the Chancellery is collapsing, Hitler retires in a fully equipped bunker underground. Even though he'll hardly ever come out again, he continues to urge troops and the population to fight. It's in this devastated country that hundreds of thousands of prisoners arrive from the east and are distributed in all the camps set up in Germany: Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, Neuengamme, and Bergen-Belsen become the main receptacles for these prisoners. In accordance with Himmler's orders, repatriated prisoners must participate in the Reich war effort on national territory. Despite the scarcity of materials and despite the Allies' bombings, the industrial pace has to be maintained.
It is the German industrial world that hires this labor force from the concentration camps for a modest sum. That is what you would call a budget manager's dream. Because of the iron law of wages, which Karl Marx had highlighted, which is that wages can be lowered to this vital minimum which allows the renewal of the labor force. Well, German industry no longer even had to respect this iron law, since the SS provide by abundant turnover a workforce that is renewed. And the German industry has profited with cold hard cash from all this.
The influx of prisoners from the east caused an explosion in the concentration camp population in the camps located in Germany. There is neither food nor shelter, and their long marches have often weakened them beyond remedy. Sickness and mortality reach hitherto unequaled records. But the apocalypse may well be in Bergen-Belsen.
It was so... We knew it was the end of the war. We were pretty sure that it was the end of the war because we could see all these people arriving from everywhere. But we were thinking that we couldn't last even a few more weeks. We couldn't hold on. What with typhus, hunger, exhaustion. But also there was no desire left. We'd had so much. We felt so degraded, so... In Birkenau, we had a desire. First, to vanquish, to live. But now we were thinking that anyway, even if we get out of here, we won't be able to live a normal life.
At the end of March 1945, the Soviets crossed the Oder to the east. The Allies crossed the Rhine to the west. Entire regiments of the Wehrmacht were taken prisoner. The decline of the German army is only a question of weeks. Faced with the collective collapse, Himmler has been trying for months, in the greatest secrecy, to be recognized by the Allies as a man of power, responsible and pragmatic. Take care of these Jews and treat them well. They are my best asset, announces Himmler to Commandant Ziereis, who oversees the Mauthausen camp. In order to maintain control over the prisoners, the head of the SS decides to evacuate the German detention centers, as the Allies and the Soviets advanced during spring 1945. For the prisoners, after having dreamed of leaving the camps for so long, being requisitioned for those marches, which they know are extremely dangerous, is a final ordeal.
Once you're outside the concentration camp, it is an interesting intensification of your vulnerability from so many directions. The landscape, the roads, the fields, the accommodations of where you'll sleep, of who you're with, these are all uncertainties. The camp is a kind of a known entity, it's a familiarity. And so to leave it requires a new socialization, an experience that they haven't had before.
Each march becomes a particular case, marked by inconsistencies and blows of fate. Where to go? No one knows anymore. As in the Baltic countries during the summer of 1944, as in Poland during the winter of 1945, it is the guards from the camps responsible for escorting the marchers who in the spring of 1945 ultimately become the decision makers of their fate. But on Austro-German territory, these guards will be joined by civilians whom nothing predisposed to participate in the murderous madness that accompanies these last marches.
There is a fundamental mechanism to explain the mass participation in this wave of exactions. It is the constitution of what is called the Volkssturm. In the spring of 1944, under the aegis of Joseph Goebbels, the district leader of Berlin and Minister of Propaganda, the idea of a full mobilization of the German population to the war service is put into place. So, if you will, these are local militias made up essentially of the remaining male population, those who escaped military conscription, that is to say, men over 45 and 15 to 20-year-olds, and also the integration of females, depending on the case. These Volkssturm units are supposed to be units that are assigned to the defense of local territories. That is, they are meant to oppose the Soviet advance as it happens. And so you're dealing with a population which is indeed frightened, desperate, and which has been armed. And they are entrusted to a framework which comes from the Wehrmacht and which has been selected for its ideological reliability and its ruthlessness. This explains to a certain extent the dynamics of aggression against the columns of the death marches.
These last-minute Nazi militias consider the captives, who are carried from one camp to the other, as enemies to be slaughtered. The Volkssturm, which can be translated as People's Storm, brings to a peak violence and crimes committed during the death marches. Throughout the country, depending on the verdict of a convoy leader, a local decision maker, or the reaction of the locals, the marchers can be liquidated at any time.
est-ce encore tuer que d'autres...
Is it still killing to take away the life, to kill a being who now lacks the appearance of a human, a being who's no more than a shadow, a being who is emaciated, a being who is half naked and who has been stripped of practically all of the character of his humanity? It's Levinas who reminded us of the importance of the face. And it's George Moss who told us of the importance of clothes. Are these striped pajamas really clothes? I don't believe so. And so, these German representations, which are in the process of being put into place, show those beings, those shadows, as enemies, and show at the same time that they are already so beyond humanity that this is not murder.
These collective killings draw a very particular veil over the state of mind of part of the population, even if they were more the exception than the norm. Elsewhere, ordinary citizens sometimes threw food or blankets and offered water. Some, much rarer, housed fugitives, but most often, these innumerable columns of exhausted ghosts of people, of ragged skeletons crisscrossing Germany and Austria, arouse only terror and indifference. Of these deadly journeys, there are only very rare photos.
So we have some recent cases of a young woman, Maria Seidenberger, and she took some photographs of marchers walking through her village. I think this was early, mid-1945, in those third wave of evacuations. And she claims that her mother gave the marchers some food, some potatoes, and this enabled her to kind of take some photo. It's very difficult to find this archive footage of the marches because people are still reluctant to come forward because of the shame about holding these archives and a fear of reprisal if they come forward, and also a reputational association that they witnessed something so profoundly dehumanizing but also did nothing about it.
Only the death of the man who had forbidden any negotiation with the Allies could end the interminable agony of the Third Reich. Hitler's suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, finally paves the way to negotiations. These take another long week before the signing of the surrender on May 8th, 1945. Cruel days, during which the war continues, as does the suffering. During this handful of days, perhaps the most senseless of them all, the columns of marchers are torn between the hope of liberation, the fear of massacre, and the threat of falling under stray bullets and bombardments.
We walked some more. For how long? Maybe 8 days, maybe. I don't know. On the 1st of May, one fine morning, we wake up. As I told you, we were put in a meadow at night. We woke up and no more SS.
And off we go. There were 5 of us, women, walking all alone in Germany, when suddenly, from afar, we see a soldier. And I say, Sabine, they aren't Jerry's, they could be allies. She says, come on, let's go see them. And then the 5 of us went towards them. And we see a rifle, a soldier, a machine gun, the jeep behind. That was the first time I saw a jeep. And he asks us, Polski, Ruski, Franzuski? So I say French. He tells me all French women in Germany are volunteers. I say, what? I was with Sabine, who could have been my mother. How's that? She tells me, well, all the other prisoners have papers, but we don't have any. Listen, that means you are volunteer women. So we tell him, no. And I do this. What about this for an ID? And he says in Yiddish, "Are you Jewish?" Yes, and everything went fine. They were a division of American Jews who'd come to Europe to avenge their families.
And on May 10th, 1945, after the armistice signing, the Russians arrive. And through the window of this dormitory where I sleep, I see a man on a motorcycle with a red flag, but it's already too late. We don't feel the joy of liberation. If it had lasted 2, 3, 4 more months, no one would have returned.